So thanks for coming out on Friday night. It's very exciting. Thanks for spending your Friday night here. Can you hear me okay? Is it sound good? So, yeah, thanks so much to Blushing Organics and to Rob for making this event happen. As Rob was introduced, I work with this organization, Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, and this is the list of members. So, yeah, some farmer organization, environmental groups, and coalitions and grassroots groups. And we work also in partnership with some groups internationally, particularly in West Africa and Asia, where farmers have a lot of concerns about genetically engineered foods, particularly GMO, which is the crop grown there, or could be in many countries. So Rob has introduced this genetically modified apple, the apple that's modified or engineered, to use the same term, to not turn brown after it's been sliced. So it won't turn brown for 15 or 18 days. And this is when the industry talks about the benefits of biotechnology. The apple actually features quite largely at the moment. And the industry is saying this is a product that will improve visual appeal and reduce waste. This is the benefit of the apple as far as the industry, the biotechnology industry, is concerned. And this is what the president of the company says, is that actually eating a whole apple, it's too big of a commitment for most people. And you know, if you had your meeting, your corporate meeting, you had a bowl of sliced apples, wouldn't it be nice if they didn't brown and everyone would take them? So I think if we're going to look at this question of what's next, I think it's fair to look at the apple. It actually would be the first genetically modified fruit to be grown in Canada. It could be approved any day. So, you know, I think, you know, from various laughter, you know, we might have our opinion on the value of this apple. Is it useful? Saying Rob, as a producer, has said it's not useful and it would mislead consumers, for example. So, you know, it's not a great start for us to look at evaluating this industry if this is one of the products coming next. But genetic engineering is a really powerful technology. Surely there's got to be more to it than a non-browning apple. So we'll look at that today. But genetic engineering, you can also, as I say, call it genetic modification, allows scientists to move genes at the molecular level, across species barrier, across kingdom barriers, so you can do something that you could never do before in nature, like move a fish gene into a tomato. So that's across the kingdom barrier, and that is an experiment that has a patent number. It never came onto the market, but you can do that. You can theoretically do anything with genetic engineering. The reality, however, might be something different. And of course, our whole food system, the diversity that we have of plants and animals comes from farmer plant breeding, farmer animal breeding, that was constrained by the reproductive abilities of those organisms. That's no longer an obstacle. So what can we do with that, or what's next? So perhaps we can look at industry promises, because you know they're the ones researching the technology, putting it onto the market. What do they say is next? What's in the field now, if we're to evaluate this technology and what could come next, we can look at the promises versus the reality now. I think that's also quite fair. And what's next in line to be approved? This non-GMO, this non-browning GM apple is one product of a few that could be next. And then also the role of public opinion and public action, because already actually consumers, citizens have changed the trajectory of this technology. There are some products that are not on the market because of protest from people, and I think that's important. If we're to look at the future, that is extremely relevant. But you will probably have in your own mind what some of the industry promises were for this technology. Certainly more nutritious foods, higher yields, less pesticides, and crops that could really withstand all kinds of different environmental stresses. But if we look actually at what's growing now, these 4 crops are the only genetically modified crops grown in Canada. And I don't know how that might differ from your idea of what's on the market, but we grow in Canada genetically modified corn, soy, canola, and white sugar beet, which is processed into sugar. It's not used for anything else. It's very different from the red table beets that we would eat in our salads, for example. And And so a lot of the corn, soy, and canola, and the white sugar beet end up in processed food ingredients and livestock feed and biofuels. That's where these crops go. And if we look globally, almost all of the genetically modified crops in the world are a list of 4. We've traded out the white sugar beet because it's only a little bit of it is grown. Across the world, cotton is the 4th major GM crop. So almost all of the GM crops are this. And this is the entire list, 100% of all the GM crops that are grown in the field and end up as food. So we've added here some fruits, some vegetables. The papaya is grown in Hawaii, and some squash varieties grown in the US as well, like yellow crookneck squash. The papaya and squash are engineered to be virus resistant, but there's only a little bit that's grown, and we tend not to import those. And then there's some GM alfalfa that's grown in the United States as well. But that's it. So I don't know how that perhaps contradicts with some of the products you thought you were eating that were genetically modified, but just to make the point, because often it's hard to believe that this is all we have at the moment. You know, this is what it looks like in pie chart format. Almost 50% of all the GM acres is soy, and then it's corn, cotton, and canola. And if we look at what these are engineered for, not a lot. Essentially 2 main traits, the biggest of which is herbicide tolerance, where the crops are engineered to withstand spraying from brand name corporate herbicides, so that all of the other weeds will die, but the plants, even if they're the crop plants, even if they're young or they just have to be sprayed several times, they will survive. So these are the herbicide tolerant crops. The seed is twinned with a brand name herbicide. They work together. It's very convenient for farmers who are using chemicals because they don't have to worry about the plants surviving those sprayings. And then the second is this insect resistance, the crops that are engineered to be toxic to certain groups of insects. So the theory is that instead of using chemical insecticides on your crops, corn in particular, that you would instead have a crop that itself kills the insects. So the insects would go to eat that crop and then die. And it's called BT. And of course what's happening now is that companies are putting both traits together. So you have a lot of crops that are both herbicide tolerant and insect resistant. It's called stacking. But this means that essentially, well, in reality, 84% of all of the genetically modified crops, these corn, canola, soy that I talked about, 84% of them are herbicide tolerant. So 84% of them are designed to be used with pesticides. You can use the word pesticides to describe herbicides or insecticides. And less than 1% is this disease-resistant promise from the industry. And so this is what it looks like. This herbicide tolerance is dominant. If you add the stacked traits, that's 84%, and then the rest is insect resistance. So it's even hard to slice in the virus resistance into that graphic. So we often hear that genetically engineered crops are grown everywhere, just like we hear that they are everywhere in our food system. But this is in reality where they're grown, mostly in the United States and then Brazil and Argentina. And that is, for the most part, GM corn and soy, and a lot of it goes into animal feed. India grows a lot of GM cotton, which accounts for that large number of 6%, and Canada grows a lot of GM canola, so that accounts for that. But if we look at these 10 countries, actually 98% of all the GM crops in the world are grown by these 10 countries. And the top 3, US, Brazil, and Argentina, grow 77%. Like I say, this is herbicide-tolerant soy and corn, so it's grown with herbicides, mostly goes into animal feed. That's what's happening in Brazil and Argentina in particular. So let's look then at the reality. We can now observe some of what's happened with these genetically engineered crops. We know now that actually pesticide use has gone up with the herbicide-tolerant crops. It's logical because they are twinned with herbicides that herbicide use would continue, but actually we see an increase in the quantity of herbicides used. And of course, in some countries this is more serious than others in the way that the pesticides are used. And the insect-resistant crops are interesting because they do allow for protection in times of really intense pest infestation. It's like an insurance. So they provide protection if that's happening. If not, they don't necessarily help you. But it has been the case that those toxic plants have replaced some chemical insecticides, but that is changing now because, of course, as was predicted, insects are becoming resistant to the toxin in the genetically engineered plant. And so actually, there are insecticides that now have to be used, and there's other issues as well. But when we think about those insect-resistant plants replacing insecticides, I think it's helpful to remember that that plant itself is a toxic pesticide, and it exudes a toxin in every cell all the time, and that can have an impact on soil and other organisms. It's not very well studied. So the plant itself is a pesticide in this case. And we often hear, particularly in Canada, about yield improvements from genetic engineering. And there have been yield improvements in the major crops, but it's not because of the GM trait itself. Monsanto is the largest seed company in the world. They are the largest biotechnology company in the world. When they provide corn and canola to farmers, they also have some of the best germplasm on the market. So they're providing a very high-yielding seed, and then the genetically engineered trait is put on top of that. So you have a high-yielding seed that then is herbicide tolerant. So it's not by virtue of the herbicide tolerance that you have a higher yield. And actually, as it turns out, in the US, the herbicide-tolerant soy and corn yields did not increase. And certainly in India, there was very serious problems with yields. And that's what this looks like. The yields increased by 2% only at the height of the use of this insect-resistant cotton. And the reality now, which will continue to be a reality, is this problem of contamination. That these are living organisms that we're releasing into the environment. We can't control them, we can't recall them, and any number of scenarios that you can imagine for contamination will at some point happen. So organic canola farmers no longer grow canola. Largely in Canada, organic grain farmers have stopped growing canola. There's some farmers that can grow organic canola in geographically isolated areas, but Saskatchewan grain farmers, organic grain farmers, tried to establish a class action suit to seek compensation from Monsanto and Bayer, two of the big companies that produce GM canola, because of contamination, because they lost the use of canola, because the contamination issue was so serious. And that was never heard in court, but it tells you that farmers actually lost the use of an entire crop. And most canola now that's sold is GM canola seed. And as I say, if farmers are growing non-GM canola for you, it's because they're in a geographically isolated area that allows them to do that. And we don't grow GM flax in Canada because Canadian flax farmers knew that if contamination happened, they would lose their European markets. And there was a GM flax that was developed in Saskatchewan. It almost got onto the market. It was stopped by those flax farmers, but 10 years later, we found GM flax in our exports to Europe. How did that happen? Nobody knows. And we've just seen last week a new contamination incident from field trials of a GM wheat. You'll remember that there was no wheat on the list of approved GM crops or crops on the market. And there's never been a commercially grown, genetically modified wheat. But we've seen contamination from field trials or from something else. There was a previous case where the US government just doesn't know what happened. And this is why farmers, like apple growers, are really concerned about the GM apple. Each crop has a different potential for contamination because they all are pollinated in different ways. Some are more at risk than others. And we can talk about today about alfalfa, which is a perennial crop that's pollinated by bees. and would be particularly of concern. The contamination would be particularly widespread, as opposed to soy, which you can control much better. So I've described at least part of how we would present the reality of genetically engineered crops at the moment. So the question is, what's the new reality? What's next? And the industry, from the same website that I posted before, has this as another benefit of biotechnology. This doesn't exist, but this is their promise, is knowing that consumers are getting a little concerned about genetic engineering, what kind of lovely promise can we make? There's a happy child, seemingly with granola perhaps, and yet this is about peanuts with lower allergen levels. So really tugging at the heartstrings of parents around these life-threatening peanut allergies. But this is actually what's coming next, is more herbicide-tolerant crops. Now that there has been so much glyphosate used, this pesticide that's used by Monsanto with their herbicide-tolerant corn, canola, and soy, all of these herbicide-tolerant crops have begun to create herbicide-resistant weeds. So the weeds are no longer being killed by the pesticides that were trimmed with this technology. So what do you do when your Monsanto's Roundup Ready, glyphosate-resistant, herbicide-tolerant crop no longer works because the weeds survive? Instead, the industry has developed new genetically engineered herbicide-tolerant crops that, instead of being tolerant to glyphosate, which is the largest pesticide used in the world, they would be tolerant to older herbicides like 2,4-D and dicamba. And 2,4-D in particular, we know that this is a very problematic pesticide for potential health implications. And so it's quite alarming, but if we're to look at what's next for GMOs, well, it looks like more of the same, at least in the immediate. More pesticides, in fact, potentially more harmful pesticides. And the GM alfalfa is where we see this, and again, this is a herbicide-tolerant crop, the alfalfa. So it's really important because alfalfa is used, not just for sandwiches like alfalfa sprouts, but as many of you know, it's used to feed livestock and dairy cows. Farmers grow alfalfa for hay that's fed to the animals, but alfalfa is also grown for feeding the soil, for grain farming, and for even vegetable farming. It's actually really important to all kinds of small-scale farmers across the countries. And as it happens, Canada is one of the largest markets for dehydrated alfalfa products, which we ship to Japan, for example, to feed livestock in other countries. So there's a lot of farmers that rely on alfalfa, including grass-fed beef, for example, who want non-GM alfalfa for export markets, or for people who want to eat organic or non-GM. And as I mentioned, alfalfa is a perennial crop. It's pollinated by bees. It's got tiny, tiny seed. It jumps around. It survives really well in ditches. The potential for contamination is quite wide. And then we have this GM non-browning apple. And as it happens, the first GM food animal in the world could soon be approved that would be produced in Canada, which is this genetically modified, fast-growing salmon. So the two that are in yellow there, the 2,4-D tolerant crops and the GM alfalfa, have been approved, but they're not yet on the market. And the two others, the apple and the salmon, could be approved any day. And of course, there's no consultation, and all of that happens in secret. So this is what's happening, but surely this technology can provide us with something bigger and better. And this is what the industry tells us, is that this amazing technology can feed the world. We need a solution because a lot of people are hungry. But of course, who owns this technology? The 6 largest seed and agrochemical companies own over 60% of the commercial seed market. And they own almost 80% of all the agrochemicals. So they have a vested interest in using pesticides with the GM seeds and in making sure that they can sell these seeds. This is not technology that they're giving away. And when companies own the seed, this is what happens, is the seed prices go up. We can see that very clearly now. But many of you may have heard in the media discussion about, genetic engineering, we need to use it for, the best possible outcome. And there is this genetically engineered vitamin A rice called golden rice, which would, the industry says, address this vitamin A deficiency, where many children around the world who are malnourished can go blind from this vitamin A deficiency in particular. The industry says, again, that this is one of the major promises, is improved nutrition. And golden rice, you see, is the first on that list there. But none of these yet exist. It already cost $100 million to develop golden rice by 2001. That's a huge investment in one technology where we still don't know if the vitamin A will actually be bioavailable. Is the beta-carotene available after storing past 3 months? That's what people do with rice, they store the rice. And your body, in order to absorb beta-carotene, you need to be also eating fat. And people who are malnourished are not necessarily, accessing the fat that they need to absorb the beta-carotene. So these are just some of the still questions about this golden rice. But if you've been looking at the media, you would think these aren't issues, that everything's resolved and that this crop is close to the market. Of course, there are lots of ways to get vitamin A, any number of local crops that people could grow. And the people who are putting forward the golden rice as a solution, as a way to make genetic engineering more relevant, say, of course, that the best way to avoid micronutrient deficiencies is a balanced diet. So what's the solution to hunger? Food. Or a supplement that for just a few cents you can provide 1 or 2 times a year, the red or the blue, depending on how old you are. This is a technology that the Canadian government has invested in heavily and that is already working in the Philippines, for example, in combination with food fortification, encouraging breastfeeding, use of community gardens, and these supplements. So that's the current reality, sort of contrasting some of the promises with the reality in the ground for the technology. But there's another reality I just want to introduce, which is the political or policy reality. Because the industry has a goal, which is to introduce these technologies, and one of the best ways for them to do that is to eliminate regulation. And actually the Canadian government is going quite far along to end regulation of genetically engineered crops. Because there's this new proposal on the table from Agriculture Canada called Low-Level Presence, which essentially says that Health Canada is no longer relevant in certain cases. So the proposal is that we accept contamination from GM food that's been approved by other countries, but not by Health Canada. If Health Canada decides that the regulatory agencies in these other countries is generally trusted, it's generally good, thumbs up from Health Canada to the regulatory system in China or Europe or Uruguay or wherever, and even though Health Canada hasn't regulated, they're going to assume it's safe. And so this would put an end to what exists around the world, which is a dependence on our own domestic regulatory agencies. Why would we do this? And just as another way to explain what this is, it's because the Canadian government wants to make sure that Canadian farmers can send our exports across to Europe and other countries, even when they're contaminated by GM, and those countries will accept them. So the GM flax incident wouldn't be an issue if Europe just accepted the flax. Sure, their regulatory agencies haven't approved them as safe, they didn't approve the flax, but surely Europe could just trust Canada's regulatory agency, Health Canada's decision, and accept 5%, 2% contamination. So that's what's happening here. There's a trade agenda because we're sending exports that are sometimes contaminated contaminated, quarantined. There's economic cost to Canada when we grow GM crops that are not approved as safe in other countries. And that's what this is about. So that we would be the first country in the world to accept GM contamination as safe from unapproved GM crops, crops that Health Canada has not approved. We would do that to make sure that we can keep exporting contaminated products. So that could happen, but it may not because of public resistance. Because the public in Canada and elsewhere has accomplished a great deal and changed the history of genetic engineering. And we've already stopped genetically engineered wheat. This is why wheat that's been genetically engineered is not on the market. It's because consumers and farmers in Canada and the United States stopped it from happening. Monsanto had to withdraw their application for approval of GM wheat because the controversy was too big. The international market was not going to accept GM wheat. And the same is true for this technology that Rob mentioned in introducing me, called Terminator. The genetic engineering of seeds so that they're sterile after first harvest. This is a technology that companies wanted on the market for obvious reasons. Farmers save seeds, and those farmers are not buying seed. But if you introduce a seed that's sterile, farmers need to buy seed every season. And here you see women of the peasant movement Via Campesina in Brazil at a United Nations meeting, and they are calling this seed, that it switches off seed fertility, a genocide seed, because that is how they see the impact of the seed on small-scale farmers, and that is why there is an international moratorium on even field testing the seed as well as commercializing it. So this is the power of small-scale farmers around the world, is they stopped what would have been the most amazing technology for companies. And in Canada, we have stopped the first GM food animal, this GM pig, from being approved in 2012. A university in Ontario was very close to getting this GM pig approved, and they didn't. It's now, a dissolved project. It's not going to happen. And that's because people weren't going to accept it. Canadians weren't going to accept it. And so this is what it looks like, is actually Monsanto's first product that they wanted to put on the market in Canada was bovine growth hormone. And I don't know if you remember, this was a veterinary drug to inject into dairy cows to increase milk production. It took 10 years, but small farmers in Canada and consumers like you stopped the introduction of Monsanto's first product, this bovine growth hormone. And the GM potatoes came on the market, came off the market, flax never came on the market. So, if we look at GM alfalfa as a final way to understand the kind of impact we can have, this is a still from a video that the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network put out that explains the impact of GM alfalfa as it was introduced. And this is the bee really distressed that you have this patented GM alfalfa plant appearing, because of course the bee will pollinate and move that pollen around, which it doesn't want to do in our video. And this is a dairy farmer, an organic dairy farmer in Ontario who runs a dairy co-op. And they're very concerned because, of course, it would mean that GM alfalfa somehow, if that contamination happens, it's going to be very hard on dairy farmers, livestock farmers in the immediate, and it would impact potentially the food that you're eating. Which is why, really, we formed this really amazing campaign with farmer organizations across the country to protect family farms through stopping GM alfalfa. And I don't know if some of you participated, but we held a day of action with the National Farmers Union in April of last year, and it was 38 rallies across the country, including here in Red Deer. This is also in Red Deer, and Calgary, and Camrose, and Grand Prairie. And this is us outside of the Ottawa office of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And this is in Guelph, where the GM pig was produced, and Monsanto has a major office, and in Nova Scotia. And the result was that actually last year, GM alfalfa was not put on the market. It was delayed. It could still be put on the market. The company could do that any time, but they did not do it last year when they could have. And it's because of this type of protest. So, there is the option at Blush Lane Organic Market to buy organic products that are produced by farmers who do not use GM seeds. This is what organic means, is that farmers are rejecting GM products. They're prohibited in organic farming. Those farmers also don't use chemical pesticides. They also adhere to animal welfare standards and build the soil and take on a whole suite of practices for sustainable agriculture. But then you also might have seen this other logo for the non-GMO project, which is also products that are verified to be non-GM. They may still be grown with pesticides if they're not also organic. But you have these two options in the grocery store. And if we take those options, and also the option of action, like the petition that's here to stop the GM apple, then we can support growers and also support the kind of choices that we want. And this seal will appear in the window or door of Blush Lane Organic Market as a pledge to you that no GM apple will enter that door. And it's also a way to stand in solidarity with those farmers. And here you have in the bags or on the way out this postcard of information, which is a good set of information if you wanted to take action on this issue, if you want to write to your member of parliament, if you want to write to the bigger grocery chains, if you shop at one of the bigger grocery chains, and try and get this GM apple stopped. And if you want more information or to take action, this is our website. And we're happy anytime to provide new information, facilitate action, and